He pointed at her across the table and laughed first. Not a polite chuckle. Not the awkward kind that fills a room when someone says something they shouldn't. Victor Hale threw his head back and laughed the way men laugh when they know no one in the room will stop them loud, deliberate, with his whole chest, and then he looked at Mara Cole sitting at the far end of that long dinner table and said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "You know what your problem is, sweetheart. You've spent your whole life watching other people succeed and calling it inspiration. You're a loser who married well, and everybody here knows it." The room went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then the laughter started. If this story already has you gripped, stay with us. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because the stories on this channel don't ease you in gently. They start exactly like this. You don't want to miss what comes next. The invitation had come on thick cream cardstock with Victor Hale's initials embossed in the corner, which should have told Ethan everything he needed to know about the kind of evening it was going to be. Annual Leadership Circle dinner. Black tie preferred. Spouses welcome. Mara had read it twice, set it on the kitchen counter, and said nothing for a moment. Then, do we have to go? It's Victor, Ethan said, as if that explained it. She nodded slowly. I know who it is. This is the year, Mara. I can feel it. 11 years. I've been in line for the VP position for 2 cycles now, and Victor told me directly that the announcement is coming at the end of Q4. This dinner is part of that. Mara looked at him the way she sometimes did when she had something to say and had decided not to say it. It wasn't quite sadness. It wasn't quite frustration. It was something in between that Ethan had never learned to read properly because he'd never thought to ask. Then we'll go, she said. She wore a dark blue dress that night. Simple cut, no embellishment. Her hair was down. She didn't try to impress anyone because Ethan would understand this only much later. She had stopped needing to impress anyone a long time ago. They arrived at the Thornfield Club at 7:15. The room was everything Victor Hale liked, excessive in a way that pretended not to be. High ceilings, low lighting, the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than most people's car payments. 40 or 50 people in dinner wear, the men shaking hands too firmly, the women performing their own separate negotiations at the edges of the room. Ethan recognized most of them. Senior leadership, department heads, a few board-adjacent figures he didn't know well. He worked the room the way he'd learned to, not with false warmth, but with steady, earned familiarity. He knew people's kids' names. He remembered who'd had surgery last spring, who was training for a marathon, whose father had passed in February. That wasn't strategy. That was just Ethan. Mara stayed close to him for the first hour. She was polite, measured, said the right things without saying much. A few people asked what she did, and she gave her standard answer. Private consulting, mostly boring, and most of them nodded and turned back to whoever was more interesting. Ethan noticed, but not the way he should have. He assumed she was uncomfortable in rooms like this. Shy, maybe. Or just not ambitious in the particular way these rooms required. He loved her for it, in a passive kind of way, the way you love the part of a person that doesn't need anything from you. He thought of her as the quieter half of their life, the stable part. He was wrong about almost everything. Dinner was served at 8:30. Long rectangular tables assigned seating. Ethan found his card near the middle, close to Victor's end, a good sign, he thought. Mara was placed further down, beside the CFO's wife, a woman named Patricia who talked exclusively about their renovation in Aspen. Victor arrived late, as he always did. 54 years old, silver at the temples, the kind of physical confidence that came not from the gym, but from decades of being the most important person in every room he entered. He moved through the dinner like he was conducting it, stopping to grip shoulders, lean in with private jokes, dispatch praise and dismissal in equal measure. He sat at the head of the table, and the room arranged itself accordingly. The meal was good. The wine was better. Conversation moved the way it does at these things, professionally personal, carefully casual. Ethan talked shop with 2 of the regional directors and felt the familiar warmth of being exactly where his work had placed him. This was what 11 years felt like. This was the shape of it. He didn't see it coming. He wasn't sure anyone did. Victor had been talking about market expansion to his left, some deal in the Pacific Northwest, a distribution network they were finalizing, and then something made him look down the table. Maybe he'd heard Patricia mention the consulting work. Maybe one of the junior executives had asked Mara a question. Ethan wasn't tracking it. What he heard was Victor's voice shift. It went from the smooth executive register controlled, inclusive to something flatter. Something that had an edge to it that it was trying not to show. Consulting, Victor said, loud enough to interrupt the conversations around him. Several people looked up. What kind of consulting? Mara looked at him calmly. Financial advisory. Private sector. Private sector. Victor repeated it like he was tasting something. So you help small businesses do their taxes? That sort of thing? A beat, Mara didn't rise to it, among other things. That's good, Victor said, nodding in that way. He had the nod that was never actual agreement. Somebody has to help the little guys. He picked up his wine glass. Then, like it was an afterthought, Ethan's worked his whole career at a company like ours. You know, the real game. Must be a different world, looking at it from the outside. Table had gotten quieter. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. She's not on the outside, he said, careful to keep his voice even. She runs her own firm. Of course, of course. Victor waved a hand. I just mean it's not the same, is it? Corporate structure, real stakes, the kind of pressure that actually shapes you. He looked at Mara directly then. Not rudely. Almost conversationally, which was somehow worse. No offense, I'm sure what you do is fulfilling. None taken, Mara said. Ethan exhaled slowly. Let it go. Victor was like this. He tested people. It didn't mean anything. But Victor wasn't done. He turned to the man on his right, Davis Crane, head of mergers, someone Ethan had known for 6 years, and said something in a lower voice. Ethan caught pieces of it. Married well. Doesn't have to prove anything. Davis smiled. Then the man beside Davis smiled. And Victor encouraged, let his voice carry. You know what I always say. He was addressing the table now, the way he did when he wanted an audience. Behind every successful man, there's either a very supportive woman or a very miserable one. He looked down at Mara. Which one are you, sweetheart? The table laughed. Not all of it. Not uniformly, but enough. The nervous kind of laugh, the laugh people use when they don't know if they should stop something and have decided not to. Ethan laughed too. One short, reflexive sound. The kind your body produces before your brain has caught up. The kind you produce because you've been trained, by years in rooms like this one, to follow the register of the most powerful person present. He heard it come out of himself and felt sick, and then he looked at Mara. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. Doing something worse, she was sitting completely still, looking at her plate, with an expression that had nothing in it at all. The expression of someone who had learned, a long time ago, how to make themselves invisible in a room full of people who weren't looking anyway. Then Victor leaned back, pleased with himself, and added the final part, you know what your problem is, sweetheart. You've spent your whole life watching other people succeed and calling it inspiration. You're a loser who married well, and everybody here knows it. The silence lasted 1 second. The laughter lasted longer. Ethan sat with his hand around his wine glass and felt the specific cold of knowing exactly what you're about to do before you do it. He put the glass down. He stood up. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't knock anything over. He simply pushed his chair back and got to his feet, and the motion was enough to stop the laughter because no one in this room stood up in the middle of dinner unless something was wrong. Victor, his voice came out steady. He hadn't planned it to be. It just was. Victor looked at him with mild interest. The expression of a man who has never seriously considered the possibility of being interrupted. You want to tell a joke? Tell a joke, Ethan said. But she's not the punchline. A beat. Victor tilted his head slightly. Ethan, I've been in this company for 11 years. I've worked for you for 6. I've stayed late. I've traveled. He stopped. That wasn't the point. He was making it about himself, and that wasn't the point. Whatever you think of her, whatever you think of what she does or doesn't do, she is my wife. And she came here tonight because I asked her to. That's the only reason she's in this room. And I'm not going to sit here and let you. Ethan, Victor's voice was quiet now, dangerously quiet. The voice he used in boardrooms when he'd decided something. Think very carefully. I have. You've been waiting for this promotion for 2 years. I know. I've been going to bat for you internally. Do you understand what I'm telling you? There are conversations happening about you at a level you don't have visibility into. And I have been the person standing in that room making the case for you. I believe you, Ethan said. And he did. That was the complicated part. Then sit down. Ethan looked at Mara. She was looking at him now. He couldn't read her expression. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It wasn't surprise. It was something more careful than either of those things. Can't, he said. He pulled Mara's chair out. She stood. He didn't touch her arm, didn't make it a performance. They just stood there together. "If you walk out of this room," Victor said, still quiet, "I'll make sure the only door that opens for you in this industry is the one leading out." "Then that's what you'll do," Ethan said. He said goodnight to no one in particular. They walked to the exit. Behind them, the room was very still. In the elevator going down, Mara stared at the doors. Ethan stared at the floor numbers dropping. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know, 11 years, Ethan. I know, he'll follow through. Victor doesn't make empty threats. I know that too." The elevator opened. They walked across the marble lobby, through the revolving door, out into the cold October air. Ethan's car was at the valet. They waited in silence. He couldn't tell if she was angry. He couldn't tell if she was grateful. He couldn't tell if she thought he'd just done something noble or something stupid, and from where he was standing, he wasn't entirely sure himself. The car came. The valet handed him the keys. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, "for the laugh. Before I laughed." Mara was quiet for a moment. "I know you did. It was automatic. I didn't mean." "I know that too." He opened her door. She got in. He walked around to the driver's side and sat behind the wheel for a second before starting the engine. "Are you angry?" he asked. "At Victor?" "Yes." "At me?" Another pause, shorter this time. "No, not anymore." He pulled out of the lot. They drove the first 10 minutes without talking. The city moved past them, streetlights, late pedestrians, a delivery truck blocking a lane. "What you said," Mara started. "About me being your wife and coming because you asked." "I meant it. I know you meant it." She looked out the window. I thought you might not. In that moment. I thought you'd weigh it. I did weigh it. And..." He glanced at her. "And I know what I'd regret." She didn't say anything to that. She turned back to the window. But something in the set of her shoulders changed, slightly released something it had been holding. Ethan drove and thought about what Victor had said. "I'll make sure the only door that opens for you is the one leading out." He thought about that sentence, the way you turn over something in your hands in the dark, feeling its edges. Victor was connected. He was the kind of connected that made phone calls other people never knew were made. Ethan knew that. He'd watched it happen to other people. He'd spent 11 years becoming somebody. Not a celebrity, not somebody who made headlines. Kind of somebody that mattered inside of a specific world, reliable, trusted, good at a complicated job. He'd built that thing one day at a time, and he'd just put it on the table. For what? He turned the question over honestly. For Mara, who sat next to him in the passenger seat, not saying anything, wearing the dark blue dress, watching the city go by. He thought, yeah, that's what I did it for. He wasn't sure if that made him brave or foolish. He suspected it might be both. He'd figure out the cost later. What Ethan did not think about, because he had no reason to, was what Mara had been doing that afternoon. Before she'd put on the dress, before she'd read his nervous energy about the dinner and said they'd go. While he'd been reviewing notes and checking his tie in the bathroom mirror, she had been on a call with her legal team, reviewing the final signatures on a transaction that had taken 14 months to close. He didn't know about that call. He didn't know about the 14 months. He didn't know about the transaction. He didn't know about the firm that bore no name he'd ever heard her mention, or the 58%, or the Monday morning that was now only 60 hours away. He knew Mara. He knew her laugh and the way she slept, and what she was like when she was worried, and what she ordered when they went to the Thai place on Clement Street. He knew she worked from home and took calls with the office door closed sometimes, and occasionally went to meetings she didn't talk about in much detail. He thought he understood her life. He was about to find out how much of it he had never seen. But that was later. Tonight he drove home. He loosened his tie at a red light. Mara fell asleep before they hit the bridge, her head tipped toward the window, her breathing slow and even. Turned the radio down low so it wouldn't wake her. He thought about Victor's face. The precise expression of a man who had decided someone was finished. He'd seen that expression deployed on other people. He'd never been on the receiving end before. It sat differently than he expected. He'd expected it to feel like panic, or grief, or the particular sickness of knowing you'd undone something irreplaceable. But what he felt instead was strange as it was mostly quiet. Not relief, not quite. Something below relief, something older. He'd chosen her. Over all of it, he'd chosen her. Whatever came next, that part wasn't something Victor could touch. He pulled into the driveway. He let the engine run for a moment, looking at the front of the house. The light they always left on over the door. The crack in the second porch step he'd been meaning to fix since March. He turned off the ignition. "Hey," he said softly. Mara stirred, opened her eyes. Took a second to remember where she was. "We're home," Ethan said. She looked at him. And for just a second, one unguarded second before she was fully awake, her expression said something he didn't have a name for. Something that looked, if he had to guess, like the face of a person who had been carrying something alone for a long time and had just felt, for the first time in a while, like she didn't have to. Then she blinked, and it was gone. And she was just Mara again, reaching for her bag, getting out of the car, walking to the front door. He followed her inside. He did not yet know that across the city, in a glass and steel building on the 43rd floor, the last documents of an acquisition were being filed. He did not yet know that on Monday morning, his world would rearrange itself entirely. He just locked the front door, hung up his keys, and went to find his wife. He woke up at 5:40 in the morning and lay there staring at the ceiling for a while, before he accepted that sleep was finished. Mara was still out. She slept on her side, facing the wall, one arm folded under the pillow the way she always did. Her breathing was slow and even. Whatever she was carrying, she wore it lightly in sleep she always had. Ethan had envied that about her for years without ever telling her. He got up carefully, pulled on a sweatshirt, and went downstairs. The kitchen was dark. He didn't turn on the overhead light, just the small one under the cabinet above the stove, the one that put out enough yellow warmth to make coffee by. He stood at the counter and waited for the machine and thought about Victor. He'd been thinking about Victor since approximately the moment the elevator doors closed at the Thornfield Club, and he had not stopped. "I'll make sure the only door that opens for you is the one leading out." He knew what that meant in practice. Calls made quietly. References that didn't quite land. Opportunities that never materialized without explanation. Victor had built a network over 30 years, and he maintained it the way old generals maintained alliances, not through affection, but through utility and the long memory of favors owed. Ethan wasn't naive about how these things worked. He'd watched it happen. He'd benefited from some of it himself in the years when Victor had liked him. Coffee finished. He poured a cup and sat at the kitchen table. He tried to think about regret. He turned the question over seriously, the way he felt he owed it to himself to do. 11 years. The progression of them, junior analyst to mid-level, mid-level to senior, senior to the edge of something that actually had weight behind it. The VP position wasn't just money. It was the thing that told the story of your career back to you in a way that made sense. It said, you were right to bet on this. The work meant something. You weren't wrong. He thought about all of that. He held it. Then he thought about Mara's face at that table, the stillness of it, the way she'd made herself go flat and small in a room full of people who were supposed to be celebrating someone's success. He thought about the 1 second of silence before the laughter. He thought about his own voice coming out of his chest before he'd decided to use it. He picked up his coffee cup and took a sip. No, he didn't regret it. He was scared that was true, and he was willing to name it. Scared of the specific future Victor was capable of making. But regret wasn't what he felt. He needed to be clear about that with himself, because in the coming days there would be moments when fear dressed itself as regret, and he needed to know the difference. He sat there until the sky outside the window started to change color. Mara came down at 7:15. She was already dressed not for the office, just in jeans and a gray sweater, her hair pulled back. She poured herself coffee without saying anything, stood at the counter for a moment, then sat down across from him. "You've been up a while," she said. "Yeah. Thinking about work?" He considered the question, thinking about what comes as next. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something another dog, probably, or the mail carrier who came early on Saturdays. Small, ordinary sounds. "Victor called Davis Crane last night," Ethan said, after we left. "I'd bet money on it. Probably. That means by Monday it'll be settled. Whatever he's decided." "Maybe," Mara said. "Not maybe. That's how he operates." He looked at her. "You know I'm right. I know that's how he's operated in the past, yes." Something about the way she said it in the past struck him as oddly specific, but he let it go. He was tired. "I'll start making calls Monday," he said. "There are people I've worked with at other firms. It's not starting over. It's just redirecting." Mara looked at him steadily. "You don't have to have the whole plan yet. I know. But I need to feel like I'm doing something. That's different from actually doing something." He knew she was right, and he didn't want to say so. "I'll figure it out," he said. She nodded. She drank her coffee. She looked out the window for a moment. "Ethan," she said, "would I do the consulting work?" Have you ever wanted to know more about it? He blinked. The question came from a sideways angle. What do you mean? I mean, you've never really asked. In all the years I've been doing it, you know the basic shape of it, but you've never, she paused. You've never been particularly curious about the specifics. He frowned slightly, not offensively, genuinely. You always said it was boring. I said it was hard to explain. Is there a difference? She looked at him for a moment. Then something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite its opposite. Go get some rest, she said. You're running on no sleep. I'm fine, Ethan. I'll rest later. She stood, took her mug to the sink, rinsed it. Then she turned to him with her back to the counter. Whatever happens Monday, it's going to be okay. He wanted to ask her how she knew that. He didn't, because he understood she was trying to give him something, and questioning the gift wasn't the point. Yeah, he said. She left the kitchen. He heard her go into her office, the room off the hallway they'd originally called the den, and then gradually it became her workspace, with the door she sometimes closed, and the calls he sometimes overheard fragments of without meaning to. He heard the faint sound of a keyboard. He sat there another 20 minutes, alone with his coffee and the October light coming through the window. He didn't know what she was doing in that office. He didn't know that on her screen at that moment was a message from her legal team. Final confirmation of filing received. Monday's board notice has been sent. Do you want us to arrange transportation? He didn't know that she'd been awake long before him that morning, had already replied to that message, and had spent an hour reviewing the board composition of a company whose corridors Ethan walked every day. He just thought she was working. He just thought he knew what that meant. The rest of Saturday passed quietly. He mowed the grass, which needed it, and which gave him something physical to do. Mara went out in the early afternoon. She said she had a meeting, which he noted was unusual for a Saturday, but didn't pursue. She was back by 4. They ordered dinner in, watched part of a movie they'd both been meaning to watch for months and had never gotten around to. She fell asleep on the couch halfway through, which was something she did sometimes, and he covered her with the blanket from the armchair and finished the movie without her. Normal. All of it normal. Sunday was worse because there was less to do and the week was closer. He went through his files, updated his resume in a document he then closed without saving, because the act of saving it felt too much like surrender. He texted a former colleague named Ray Purcell, someone he'd worked alongside at a different firm years back, just a casual reach-out that didn't say everything it was trying to say. Ray texted back within an hour, "Hey stranger, call me Monday afternoon," and Ethan felt the small relief of that. At least one door existed. At least one person would pick up. Mara was in her office most of Sunday, door closed. He knocked once to ask if she wanted lunch, and she opened the door with the expression of someone who had been very far inside something complicated and was having to walk back out to the surface. She said yes to lunch. She seemed distracted but not worried. Something about the set of her face was different than it had been Friday night steadier, somehow, like she'd found her footing on ground he couldn't see. He made sandwiches. They ate at the kitchen table. "You're not nervous," he said. It came out as a statement. "About what?" she said. "Monday, Victor. What he's going to do." She picked up her sandwich. "People have been underestimating what I'm capable of for a long time," she said. "I've learned to find it less alarming than I used to." He wanted to ask her what she meant. He also felt obscurely that it wasn't entirely about him. So he let it sit. Sunday night he slept badly. Mara slept fine. He was up at 5:30. In the car by 7, and at his desk in the Harlow Group building by 7:45. He bought coffee from the cart in the lobby and took the elevator up and walked to his office, then sat down and looked at his desk and thought, here we go. His email had 43 new messages. He started reading. Most of it was routine. Reports, follow-ups, a thread about a client presentation scheduled for Wednesday. But at the top of his personal messages was one he almost didn't open from an address he didn't recognize. A legal firm he'd never heard of. Subject line, Notice of Extraordinary Board Session Harlow Group Holdings. He opened it. He read it twice. An emergency board session had been called for 10 that morning. Not unusual in itself, boards called emergency sessions when acquisition activity was in motion, when a major shareholder demanded it, when something material happened that required formal acknowledgement. What was unusual was the final paragraph of the notice, which stated that the session had been initiated at the request of Blackstone Ridge Capital, the holding entity that had recently acquired a controlling interest in Harlow Group Holdings. 58%. He sat with that number. He read the paragraph again. Then he went to his computer and searched Blackstone Ridge Capital. The firm had a minimal web presence, a clean, spare website with no photographs and very little copy. Asset management. Private equity, founded 12 years ago. Based in San Francisco, he stared at the screen. 12 years ago. He and Mara had moved to San Francisco 13 years ago. She'd started the consulting work about a year after that. Private sector, mostly boring. That's what she said. He sat very still. The coffee cup was in his hand, and he set it down carefully, as if the desk were fragile, as if he needed to be cautious with the space around him, while his understanding of several things rearranged itself. The door to his office was open. He could hear the floor filling up, colleagues arriving, keyboards starting, the distant sound of a morning meeting already in progress somewhere down the hall. His ordinary Monday, his ordinary life. He pulled out his phone. He called Mara. She picked up on the second ring. I got a notice, he said, about a board meeting this morning. A pause. Brief half a breath, maybe less. I know. Blackstone Ridge Capital, he said it slowly. 58% of Harlow Group. Another pause. Longer Mara, Ethan. Her voice was even, not defensive. Not apologetic. Just even, the way it got when she was choosing her words from a very specific set. I was going to tell you this weekend. I tried to find the right moment, and there wasn't one, and then Sunday it wasn't the right time. Blackstone Ridge is yours? She didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Mara, is Blackstone Ridge your firm? Yes, she said. He stood up from his desk without thinking about it. Went to his window. Looked down at the street. You own 58% of the company I work for. As of Friday afternoon, yes. As of he stopped. Friday, the day of the dinner. The acquisition closed at 4 p. We were at the Thornfield Club at 7:30. He put his hand on the window glass. It was cold, you knew. At dinner. You already knew. Yes. And you didn't. He couldn't finish the sentence because he didn't know which version of it to say. Didn't tell me? Didn't say anything? Didn't warn me? All of those were true, and all of them felt insufficient. I was going to tell you that night, she said. When we got home. I'd been working up to it all week. But then dinner happened, and then you a pause. And then it wasn't the right moment for that conversation anymore. When were you planning to tell me otherwise? Before I walked into the office this morning? Before a board meeting I didn't know was happening? My team sent the board notice last night, I assumed. I don't check my personal email after 9 p.m., Mara. You know that. I know. I should have called you this morning before you left. That was a mistake. He stayed at the window. Below him, a delivery truck was double parked, and a man in a yellow vest was loading boxes onto a dolly. An entirely ordinary morning for everyone on that street. How long, he said. How long what? How long have you been building this? Blackstone Ridge has been operating for 12 years. He absorbed that. 12 years ago, I was still mid-level. We'd been married for 3 years. You said you were doing consulting work. I was. The firm grew out of that. It wasn't a deception from the start, Ethan. It grew into something I didn't expect it to grow into, and by the time it was large enough that hiding it felt dishonest, I'd already been hiding it for long enough that telling you felt. She stopped. Felt what? Complicated, she said. It felt very complicated. He turned away from the window, sat on the edge of his desk. Victor doesn't know. Victor has no idea. He mocked you last night, at that table, in front of 40 people. He looked at you and said those things, and he has no idea that you walk into that board meeting this morning and you own the majority of his company. Correct, Mara? Yes. I don't know how to feel about this. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had something softer in it, not quite vulnerability, but something adjacent. I know, I'm sorry. The timing was nothing about this timing was good. Tell me what happens at 10 o'clock. I go to the board meeting. I introduce myself in my official capacity as the controlling shareholder of Harlow Group Holdings through Blackstone Ridge Capital, and we discuss the implications of the ownership change and what the path forward looks like. And Victor will be there. He's going to find out who you are in a boardroom full of people. Yes. Ethan pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Are you okay with that? A pause. The kind that contains something real. I've been okay with a lot of things, she said finally. Yes. I'm okay with that. He heard voices outside his office door. 2 colleagues walking past, something about the morning stand-up. Normal. Everything normal on the surface. Why did you buy the company, he said. His company. I didn't buy it because of Victor, she said carefully. I've been tracking Harlow Group for over 2 years. The The fundamentals are strong, but the leadership has been making structural decisions that are going to cause serious problems in 18 to 24 months if they go unaddressed. It was a sound acquisition at a good point in the cycle. Timing relative to Victor was a beat. It was a coincidence. Coincidence that he chose to behave the way he behaved at that dinner on the same night the acquisition closed, yes. I didn't plan that. He wanted to believe her. He thought he did believe her, mostly. He also knew Mara well enough to know that she parsed her words precisely when the stakes were high, and the timing relative to Victor was a coincidence, was a very parsed sentence. I have to go, she said. The car is here. You're coming to the office. I'm coming to the board meeting, yes. I won't be in the board meeting. No, she agreed, you won't. Not this one. He sat with that for a second. Okay, Ethan. Her voice shifted again back to something that was just her, just Mara, without the careful professional register around it. I'm sorry this isn't how I wanted you to find out. I mean that. I know you do. We'll talk tonight. Really talk. There's a lot I need to tell you. Yeah, he said. There is. She hung up. He held the phone for a moment. Then he set it on his desk and looked at the wall. He thought about 12 years. He tried to lay them end to end and see if there were signs he'd missed, moments that could have been the edges of something larger if he'd thought to look. He remembered the closed office door, the calls she took seriously, intensely, the ones where he'd catch a phrase through the door, the valuation needs to reflect current exposure, or I need that report before the weekend, and had thought, mildly, she's really into this consulting thing, and moved on. He remembered a dinner 2 years ago where someone had asked her opinion about a corporate restructuring that was in the news, some mid-sized firm changing hands, and she'd given an answer that was detailed and sharp, and the man asking had looked at her with a kind of recalibrated attention that Ethan had noticed but not understood. He'd felt a small flash of pride. That's my wife. She knows her stuff, and then the conversation had moved on. He thought about all the times he'd come home tired, and she'd been at her desk, and he'd assumed she was doing the ordinary scaled version of what she did. He thought about the trips she occasionally took San Francisco to Portland, Portland to New York, 3 days, sometimes 4. Client meetings. That's what she said. Client meetings. He thought, I never asked which clients. He'd never asked because he'd never thought the answer would be something that would require him to reconfigure every assumption he'd made about the architecture of their life. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. Are you coming to the morning stand-up? Starts in 5. He looked at the message. He wrote back, starting in 5, give me 2. He straightened his jacket. He found his coffee cup and drank the rest of it cold. He walked to his office door. Down the hall, through the glass-walled conference room, he could see his team already gathered, 6 people with laptops and coffee cups, talking through the week's priorities. His ordinary Monday, his ordinary work, the thing he'd built across 11 years and had nearly set on fire on Friday night for a reason he still didn't regret. 10 a.m., in a different room on a different floor of this same building, Mara was going to walk through a door. And Victor Hale, who had leaned back in his chair 2 nights ago with his wine glass and his certainty and called her a loser who married well, was going to understand possibly for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to have been catastrophically wrong about a person. Ethan didn't know if he was supposed to feel satisfied about that. He was honest enough to admit he did a little. He was also honest enough to admit the feeling was sitting alongside something more complicated, the slow, strange work of realizing that the person you sleep next to, the person you think you know, in the particular cellular way of long marriage, had been carrying a life inside their life that you never knew to ask about. He didn't know yet if that was a wound. He didn't know yet what it meant for the 2 of them going forward. He walked down the hall to join his team. He sat down at the table, opened his laptop, and started the meeting. And in the lobby below, at 9:52 in the morning, Mara Cole stepped out of a black car in a charcoal blazer with her bag over her shoulder and walked toward the elevator. She looked like she'd walked into buildings like this every day of her life. She had. She pressed the button for the 14th floor. The board meeting started at 10. She was not late. The stand-up meeting lasted 22 minutes. Ethan ran it on autopilot priorities. Blockers, the Wednesday client presentation, a resource question from one of the junior analysts that he answered correctly without fully remembering he'd answered it. His team was good. They didn't need much from him on a morning like this, which was fortunate, because most of him was on the 14th floor. He went back to his office afterward and closed the door. 10:03. The meeting had started 3 minutes ago. He sat at his desk and tried to do actual work. He opened the Henderson account files, stared at a spreadsheet for 4 minutes, and closed it. He picked up his phone twice without calling anyone. He stood at his window, the same window he'd stood at an hour ago when Mara told him, and looked at the street and thought about the room above him. He'd been in the 14th floor boardroom twice. Long table, 12 chairs, a wall of windows facing north. Credenza along one wall with a coffee service that was always slightly stale. Kind of room that felt important because of what happened in it, not because of anything about the room itself. He tried to picture Mara walking in. He could, actually. Once he tried, he could see it clearly the way she moved, when she was certain of something. The particular quality of stillness she had that wasn't passivity, was never passivity, was the opposite of it. He just hadn't known, all those times he'd seen it, what he was actually looking at. His phone buzzed at 10:19. A text from Davis Crane, who sat on the board as a non-executive director. "You need to tell me what's going on." Ethan looked at the message. Typed back, "I don't know more than you do," which was almost true. He sent it and put the phone face down. He didn't hear anything definitive until 11:45, when his assistant knocked and told him that Victor Hale wanted to see him in his office immediately. The word immediately was doing a lot of work in that sentence. He took the stairs to the executive floor, walked past Victor's assistant, who looked at him with an expression she was working hard to keep neutral, and knocked twice on the heavy door before opening it. Victor was standing at his window, not sitting, standing with his back to the room, looking out at the city. He was still in his jacket. His posture was the posture of a man who had been standing in exactly this position long enough that it had stopped being a choice. "Close the door," he said, without turning. Ethan closed it. "Sit down. I'll stand, thanks." Victor turned. His face was composed. Ethan had to give him that. Whatever had happened in that boardroom in the last 90 minutes, he'd had time to build the wall back up. His eyes were flat and careful. "Your wife," he said. "She controls Blackstone Ridge Capital. Yes. 58% of this company. That's what I understand." Victor looked at him for a long moment. "Did you know? Before Friday night?" "No," Ethan said. "And then, because it was also true, I found out this morning. Before the board meeting." Something moved across Victor's face. Not belief, not disbelief, something more like calculation. He was filing the information, sorting it. "She said she'd been building the firm for 12 years, Victor said. "That's what she told me too. And you had no idea." "Victor." Ethan kept his voice level. "If I'd known my wife was the controlling shareholder of the company I work for, I would have disclosed it. You know that about me." Another long look. "What does she want?" "You'd have to ask her. I'm asking you, and I'm telling you I don't speak for her. I never have." That's apparently something I didn't fully understand till recently, but it's true. Victor moved away from the window. He walked to his desk, but didn't sit, just rested one hand on the back of his chair, the way a person holds onto something nearby when they need to think. "She's calling for a governance review. Full audit of executive decision-making over the past 3 years. The board voted to proceed. A pause. 6-2. Ethan said nothing. "She has the votes," Victor said. It came out almost flat, like a clinical observation. She came in there with the votes already arranged. She'd spoken to at least 4 board members before this morning. He looked at Ethan. "That took time. That took weeks, maybe months. I wouldn't know." "No," Victor straightened. "I want you to understand something. Whatever happened Friday night at that dinner, whatever you think this is about business, doesn't work on feelings. If she moves against this company on a personal basis, she'll destroy value she just paid for. That's not smart." "She's very smart," Ethan said. "I'm not saying she isn't, Victor." Something in his voice made the older man stop. "I laughed. At that dinner, when you said those things about her. I laughed before I stopped myself, and I've thought about that every hour since. So I'm not interested in standing in your office and hearing an argument for why what you did to her was actually reasonable." He held the man's gaze. "What do you need from me today?" "Professionally. That's what I'm here for." A silence. Then Victor said, very carefully, "I need to know where your loyalties are." Ethan almost laughed. Not bitterly, it just struck him as a peculiar question from someone who had spent Friday night dismantling any claim he might have had to Ethan's loyalty. "I'm loyal to doing my job correctly, same as I've always been." That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. He left Victor's office without being dismissed. He wasn't sure he'd ever done that before. It felt less triumphant than he'd imagined. Such a moment would feel more like walking away from wreckage than from a victory. Back at his desk, he found an email from the legal department. All senior staff were being asked to submit documentation related to Q3 financial approvals for the governance review. Standard audit procedure. He read it twice, then forwarded it to his personal email and pulled up his own records. His approvals were clean. He knew they were clean because he was meticulous in a way that other people sometimes found excessive. He kept parallel records, flagged anomalies, always had a paper trail that could be followed backward to the origin. He'd developed that habit years ago, not because he expected anything like this, but because clean records let you sleep at night. He started compiling. It was something to do with his hands. He didn't see Mara until late that afternoon. She appeared in the doorway of his office at 4:50, still in the charcoal blazer, and closed the door behind her without asking. She looked tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixed, but the kind that came from a long day of being fully present in high-stakes rooms. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. "How did it go?" he said. "The board voted to proceed with the governance review. We'll have an independent audit firm in by Thursday." "I know. Legal sent the documentation request this afternoon." She nodded. "I should have told them to loop you in directly." "I didn't think about." "It's fine," he said. "My records are clean. I'll cooperate fully." She looked at him. "I know your records are clean." "Right." He leaned back in his chair. "Victor thinks this is personal. That you're doing this because of Friday night. What do you think?" He considered the question seriously. "I think you've been watching this company for 2 years, and you bought it because you thought the fundamentals were sound. I think Victor's leadership problems are real, and the audit will show that. I think Friday night is separate." He paused. "Am I right?" "Mostly," she said. "What's the mostly?" She looked at the window. The acquisition was legitimate. The decision to call for an immediate governance review rather than waiting 90 days that was accelerated. Partly because of what I saw Friday night. She turned back to him. "I'm not going to pretend that watching him perform like that had no effect on how quickly I moved." He appreciated the honesty enough not to push further. "He asked me where my loyalties are," Ethan said. "What did you say?" "That I'm loyal to doing my job." He didn't love the answer. She almost smiled. "No, I wouldn't think so." They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of his office with the late afternoon outside the window, the building settling into the slower rhythm of end of day. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and went to voicemail. "We should go home," he said. "You said we'd talk." "Yes, really talk." "Yes, Ethan, really talk." They left the building together. He noticed, in the lobby, 2 colleagues who clocked them walking out side by side and did very quick recalibrations. He could see it in their faces. The swift internal adjustment of people who were now understanding something they hadn't understood this morning. He nodded at them. They nodded back. The drive home was quiet but not uncomfortable. She had her shoes off almost before the front door closed, and he went to the kitchen and opened a bottle of the wine they kept for, when something actually needed to be said over a glass of wine. They sat at the kitchen table. Same table as Saturday morning. Same 2 chairs. It was a small house in a lot of ways. The kitchen had never been renovated. The floors were the original hardwood that showed every year of their age, and it had always been the kind of home where the table was, where the real things happened. "Tell me about it from the beginning," he said. She looked at her wine glass. "When we moved here that first year, I started doing freelance financial consulting. You remember that part?" "Yes. I was good at it. Better than I expected to be. And I started seeing patterns in the market that other people weren't seeing or weren't acting on. Small things at first. Restructuring opportunities. Undervalued positions." She turned the glass in her hands. "I had a client, I can't tell you who said I should be running my own fund. I told him that was a different scale entirely, and I didn't have the capital or the infrastructure. He offered to be the seed investor." She looked up. "That's where Blackstone Ridge came from. A conversation at a client lunch in the second year we lived here. 12 years ago. 11 and a half. And you didn't tell me. At the beginning, there wasn't much to tell. It was a small fund. Could have failed. Plenty of them do." She paused. "But it didn't fail. Clearly, it grew faster than I anticipated. By year 3, it was serious. By year 5, I understood that I'd built something that was not what I'd set out to build." He looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me when it became serious?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, working through it. 2 reasons, she said finally. "The first one is simple. I didn't know how. We had a certain balance, you and I. You had the career that had structure and title and visible momentum. I was the one who worked from home on things that were hard to explain at dinner parties. Comfortable. For both of us, I thought. And the second reason, she looked at him directly. I was scared that if you knew how much I had, it would change the way you saw yourself. I watched you, Ethan. I watched you work. I know how much your sense of yourself is tied to what you've built professionally, to earning your place. I didn't want you to look at what I had and feel like. She stopped. Like I'd failed, he said. Like it didn't matter as much. He absorbed that. He sat with it honestly, turning it over, trying to see where it was unfair and where it wasn't. That wasn't your call to make, he said. Deciding what I could handle. I know. You made a decision for both of us without asking me. Yes, and you kept making it. For 11 years. She didn't look away. Yes, he wanted to be angry. He was angry. Actually, he could feel it in his chest, the specific heat of it. But it was the complicated kind of anger that has other things braided into it. He looked at her across the table, this woman he'd known for 15 years, slept next to, argued with about vacation destinations, and whose turn it was to call the plumber, sat with through the small and large losses and the small and large reliefs, and he understood that she had kept this from him out of something that was not malice and not contempt. It was something more like fear, which made it simultaneously more understandable and more painful. I need time to process this, he said. I know, I'm not done being upset about it. You don't have to be. He picked up his glass and drank. She did the same. The clock above the stove clicked softly. Victor's going to fight, he said. The audit. All of it. He's not going to just cooperate, I know that. He came at me once already today. He'll look for leverage. I know, she said again, and something in her voice shifted careful, deliberate. Ethan, there's something else I need to tell you. He looked at her. The particular weight of that sentence. Something else. Over the past 2 years, as I was watching Harlow Group and preparing the acquisition, my team came across some financial anomalies. In the company's records, he set his glass down. They were flagged by my analysts as part of routine due diligence. Transactions that were irregular. Approvals that didn't trace back cleanly. Digital authorization signatures on internal transfers that didn't match expected patterns. He was very still. What signature? She met his eyes. Yours. The word sat between them like a dropped object. Mine, he said. Your authorization credentials. On 3 separate internal fund transfers over 8 months. Transactions that moved money through a subsidiary account in a way that was designed to look like routine operational spending, but wasn't. He felt the blood drop from his face. Mara, my team identified it 7 months ago, she said quietly. 7 months, he stared at her. 7 months ago. Yes, and you didn't tell me. She held his gaze without flinching, because she'd known this moment was coming, and she'd decided she would not flinch from it. No, I didn't tell you. Why? It came out flat. Not even a question. Because I needed to understand the full scope before I said anything. Because if I'd told you and you'd confronted Victor or gone to the board without the complete picture, he'd have buried it and taken you down with it. I needed time, and I needed the acquisition to close first, so that when the evidence came forward, it came forward in a context where it couldn't be suppressed. You were protecting me, he said. Yes, without telling me I needed protection. Yes. He pushed back his chair. Not violently, just back. Creating distance, needing space to think. He stood and went to the counter. Stood there with his back to the room for a moment, his hands on the edge of the counter, looking at the dark window above the sink. Victor set me up, he said. Not a question. He was running the logic. That's what the evidence suggests. He used your credentials to authorize transactions he didn't want traced to himself. The losses had surfaced on their own. Through a routine audit, your name would have been on the approvals, not his. He was going to let me take the fall. That's what it looks like. He turned around. He looked at Mara at the kitchen table with her wine glass and her careful, steady face, and he understood then the full shape of what she'd done. Not just the acquisition, not just the board meeting, but the 7 months before any of that 7 months of watching, protecting, maneuvering, all of it done quietly and alone and without asking him once because she judged, correctly, that he wasn't positioned to help himself. You should have told me, he said. I'm Mara. I deserve to know. You're right, she said. I made a choice I thought was protecting you, and I didn't give you the chance to choose for yourself. I know that was wrong. She paused. I'm not going to dress it up. Came back to the table. He didn't sit. He stood there, hands on the back of his chair. What happens now? The audit firm takes over Thursday. My team will turn over the financial analysis we already did. It'll be framed as due diligence discovery during the acquisition, which is accurate. The investigators will find what we found. They'll trace it, and Victor's name will be on it. Timeline, 2 weeks, maybe 3, before anything formal. And in the meantime, I just go to work. Like normal. You go to work. You cooperate with the documentation request. You submit your records, which are clean, and you let the process happen, while everyone in that building looks at me and wonders. Possibly, she said. Yes. He pulled the chair out and sat down. He was tired. Not the way he'd been tired Sunday night, lying awake with fear about Victor's retaliation. Tired in a deeper way, the tiredness of a day that had started with a phone call and a number he didn't recognize, and had arrived at a kitchen table where his wife was telling him that someone he'd trusted for 11 years had been building a trap with his name on it. He said I'd been waiting for his approval, Ethan said. Partly to himself. What? Victor. When I stood up at the dinner and told him, he said I'd been thinking about his approval for years. And I wanted to say it wasn't true. He looked at his glass. But it was. A little. He wasn't wrong about that. Mara was quiet. I wanted him to think I was worth it, Ethan said. That's an ugly thing to admit. But I did. And meanwhile he stopped. He was building a way to throw me under a bus. He was doing it for months while he shook my hand and talked about the VP position. People are capable of holding both things at once, Mara said. He probably did value your work. People can value someone's usefulness and be entirely willing to sacrifice them when the cost-benefit shifts. That's not comfort. It wasn't meant to be. It's just true. He looked at her. Are you okay with all of this today? The board meeting, Victor. The way they looked at you when you walked in. Something softened in her face. You're asking me that right now. Yes, after everything I just told you. Mara, are you okay? She looked down at the table, and for the first time since she'd sat down since the board meeting, maybe since the dinner, maybe since the 7 months of carrying this alone, something in her face let go of its precision. She didn't cry. She wasn't built for crying in the easy way some people were. But her exhale was long and uneven, and it held everything she hadn't put into words. I'm tired, she said. Yeah, I've been doing this by myself for a long time. I know, he said. You didn't have to. I thought I did. I know. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but there was something raw in them, something unguarded that she usually kept behind the careful, efficient exterior. When you stood up at that dinner, she said. When you pushed back your chair and stood up. I didn't ask you to do that. No, I had a plan. I didn't need rescuing. I know you didn't, but you didn't know that. You just stood up anyway. She pressed her lips together for a second. I've thought about that moment a lot today. He looked at her across the table. His wife. The woman who had built a 12-year parallel life and kept it in a room with a closed door, and had done it not out of deception, but out of a fear that was sad and understandable and ultimately wrong in a way that was going to take both of them time to work through. He knew that, but he also knew that across a dinner table on Friday night, in a room full of people who were laughing at her, she had sat very still with nothing on her face, and he had stood up. Not because he knew what she was, before he knew any of it. When he thought she was just Mara, just the woman he drove home and covered with a blanket and made lunch for on Sundays. Part mattered. He needed her to know it mattered. I stood up for who you were already, he said. Not for what I found out this morning. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, the small tight nod of someone receiving something they needed. They sat there for a while after that. Not resolving anything, there was too much to resolve in a single night, and they both knew it. But sitting. The clock ticking, the wine going slowly. The ordinary house around them. The next morning, Ethan was at his desk by 7:30. He submitted his documentation to the legal department at 9. He went through his day with the specific focus of someone who has decided that the thing they can control is the quality of their own work, and so that is what they will control. He didn't see Victor until late afternoon, when they passed each other in the corridor near the elevators. Victor looked at him with an expression that had been reorganized overnight, the careful blankness of someone who was no longer sure of the terrain. Ethan, he said. Victor, they kept walking. 2 men moving in opposite directions down a hallway, each understanding that the ground between them had shifted in ways that couldn't be shifted back. 3 days later, the independent audit firm arrived. They set up in 2 conference rooms on the 12th floor and began requesting files. On the 8th day of the audit, One of the lead investigators, a woman named Carver, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the focused manner of someone who had spent her career finding what people buried, called Ethan into her temporary office. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I want to ask you about your authorization credentials." He sat across from her. "Okay. When did you last update your system password?" "February. I rotate every 90 days. And between April and November of last year, the period in question, did you authorize any fund transfers to the subsidiary account listed as Harlow Operational Reserve Sub 3? "No," he said, "I've never heard of that account." She looked at him over her glasses. "Your digital signature appears on 3 authorization approvals for that account, totaling $2.4 million. Then someone used my credentials without my knowledge," he said. "I can tell you exactly what I authorized during that period. I have parallel records. Every transaction time-stamped with the originating request attached." She looked at him. "I keep parallel records," he said. "I always have. It's just how I work." She studied him. "I'd like to see those records. I'll have them to you within the hour." He brought them. All of it meticulous, organized, going back 4 years. Carver's team spent 2 days going through them. On the 3rd day, she called him back. "Mr. Cole," she said, "your records are clean. More than clean, they're the most organized self-documentation I've seen from a senior executive in 12 years of doing this work." A pause. The authorization signatures on the sub-3 transfers were generated using a spoofing method. Someone with access to system administrative tools replicated your credential signature on those approvals. You didn't make those transactions. He sat across from her very still. "No," he said, "I didn't. We're tracing the administrative access now." She looked at him over her glasses. "This is going to get complicated in the next few days. I want you to be prepared for that." "I understand," he said. "You should probably get a lawyer. I'll call one this afternoon." She nodded. As he stood to leave, she said, "For what it's worth, Mr. Cole, whoever kept those records was thinking ahead." He thought about that on the elevator back to his floor. He thought about parallel records and thinking ahead and the long, slow habit of doing the careful thing, not because you expected the worst, but because you respected the work enough to do it right. 11 years. He'd built something, all right. It wasn't the VP position, but it was the thing that was going to keep Victor Hale from taking him down with the ship. He sat at his desk. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer. And down the hall, in an office where the door was always closed and the meetings ran long, and the frame degrees on the wall were Victor Hale's 3 decades of accumulated confidence, the audit team was reading through administrative access logs and finding a thread they were very steadily beginning to pull. The thread, once pulled, unraveled faster than Victor had apparently anticipated. Carver's team found the administrative access logs on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, they had mapped the pathway, a system-level override tool that had been used 3 times over 8 months, always between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., always from a device registered to the executive floor's private network access point. The kind of access that required not just technical knowledge but positional authority. Kind that didn't exist below a certain pay grade. By Thursday morning, they had a name. Ethan found out the way most people in that building found out, not through official channels, but through the specific electricity that moves through an office when something has happened that changes the shape of everything. He was at his desk at 8:15 when his assistant knocked and said quietly that Victor Hale had not come in. His assistant was young and usually careful about her expression. She wasn't being careful now. He went still. "Has anyone heard from him?" His EA said he called in, said he needed to handle something personally. Ethan nodded and said thank you, and she left. And he sat there understanding that Victor not coming in on a Thursday during an active fraud investigation meant one of 2 things. He was with his lawyers, or he was already beyond the point where lawyers felt like enough. His phone rang at 9:40. His own attorney, a careful, methodical man named Gerald Marsh, who Ethan had retained years ago for a contract dispute and kept because he was the kind of lawyer who read everything twice and said very little until he was certain. "Carver's office contacted me this morning," Gerald said. "They're formally clearing you of any involvement in the sub-3 transfers. The written notice will be in your hands by end of day." Ethan exhaled, long and slow, through his nose, the kind of breath you take when something has been pressing on your chest for 2 weeks and has just lifted. "Okay," he said. "There's more. The investigators found evidence that the credential spoofing was executed using administrative override tools. The access log traces to an executive-level device and a network node on the 14th floor. Victor's floor. I can't confirm names, but the geographic and access level parameters they've described to me are specific. Gerald, yes, just tell me. A pause. You're in the clear, Ethan. That's what I can tell you officially. Whatever else the investigation produces, it will produce without your name attached to it. He thanked Gerald and hung up. He sat at his desk and looked at the wall for a while. He thought he would feel something more dramatic. Relief at a volume he could point to. Or anger, a clean, satisfying anger at Victor that would arrive now that the danger was past. Instead, what he felt was quieter and less comfortable. Kind of tiredness that had a question inside it. 11 years. He'd given 11 years to a man who had been constructing an exit route that ran straight through Ethan's reputation, who had shaken his hand and praised his work and talked about the VP position while keeping a trapdoor in the floor under Ethan's feet, just in case. The question inside the tiredness was, had he seen it, any of it, and chosen not to look? He sat with that honestly. It wasn't a comfortable thing to sit with. He'd admired Victor. More than was professional, probably the particular admiration that forms when someone seems to embody the version of yourself you're trying to become. Victor was decisive and connected, and moved through rooms the way successful people move, and Ethan had watched that and thought, that's the shape of it. That's what getting there looks like. He'd mistaken performance for substance. He'd been grateful for Victor's patronage in a way that made him slow to see what that patronage cost. Not stupid, not naive exactly. Just wanting the thing badly enough to accept an incomplete picture of the person handing it out. He thought about what Mara had said at the kitchen table. People can value someone's usefulness and be entirely willing to sacrifice them when the cost-benefit shifts. She'd known. Not just about Victor specifically, she'd known the type. And he wondered now, sitting at his desk with the formal clearance on its way and the building buzzing around him, how many times she'd watched him talk about Victor over dinner and had held her tongue. He pulled out his phone. Texted her, Gerald called. I'm clear officially by end of day. She replied in less than a minute, I know. Carver's office CC'd my legal team. Are you okay? He thought about the question. Getting there, he wrote back. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then, come find me when you can. She was in a conference room on the 12th floor, one of the ones the audit team wasn't using. She'd set up a temporary workspace there for the week, which Ethan understood was deliberate. She was visible, present, available to the board and the investigators, conducting herself as a controlling shareholder who was taking the governance failures seriously and not running the process from a distance. He'd noticed that about her this week. She could have done most of this remotely. She chose not to. He knocked and she waved him in. She was on a call but held up a finger 1 minute and wrapped it up with a few precise sentences about a timeline he didn't have context for. When she hung up, she looked at him. Sit down, she said. He sat. You look tired. You said that last night too. It was true last night. It's still true. She leaned back in her chair. How are you? And not the version you'd tell someone in the hallway. He considered. Relieved. And angry. And still working through some things about myself that the anger keeps interrupting. She tilted her head slightly. What things about yourself? The part where I let wanting Victor's approval make me slower than I should have been. About seeing him clearly. He looked at her. I was good at my job and I know that. But I wanted him to confirm it. Regularly. I needed the confirmation from him specifically. Which is he stopped. That's a vulnerability. It was a vulnerability he knew about, even if he didn't think of it in those terms. Mara looked at him with an expression he recognized, now the one she used when she was listening to him at depth, not just following the words. Most people need someone to believe in their work, she said. That's not a character flaw. It is when you let it make you loyal to someone who doesn't deserve it. Maybe, she said. Or maybe you were loyal to the work, and you assigned that loyalty to the nearest person who seemed to represent it. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at his hands on the table. When did you get so clear about this? I've been watching you be good at your job for 11 years, she said. Watching from close range is clarifying. He was quiet for a moment. Victor's with his lawyers. I know. What happens now? From the board's perspective. She straightened slightly, shifting into the register she used for the operational things. Carver presents her preliminary findings to the board on Friday. The evidence is substantial, not just the credential spoofing, but a pattern of financial manipulation, going back further than the sub-3 transfers. There are at least 2 other instances her team is still tracing. She paused. Victor will be given the opportunity to respond respond as he should be. But the board has already asked me as majority shareholder what my position is on his continued leadership. And your position is that the company cannot retain a CEO who is under investigation for financial fraud and who, whatever the final legal determination, has already demonstrated that he's willing to prioritize his own protection over the institution. She said it evenly, without satisfaction. Like a diagnosis. He'll fight it. He's already fighting it. His lawyer sent a letter to the board this morning claiming that the audit was initiated as a hostile action by a new shareholder with a personal conflict of interest. She looked at Ethan directly when she said it. Meaning me. Meaning Friday night. He's going to use the dinner. He's going to try. The argument being that Blackstone Ridge's acquisition and the subsequent governance review was motivated by personal grievance, not legitimate shareholder concern, and therefore the findings of the audit should be considered compromised. Ethan sat back. That's actually not a terrible legal argument. No, she said. It's not a terrible legal argument. It's a weak one, because the evidence is what it is regardless of my motivation for finding it. But it will slow things down, and he knows that. Is that a problem? It's a complication. My legal team is prepared for it. She paused. But Ethan, he's going to put our marriage in the middle of this. He's going to say that everything I did was about protecting my husband. He's going to use you, your name, your situation as the frame for his defense. Ethan looked at her steadily. Let him. You understand what that means. It means this goes public. The dinner. What he said. What you did. You and me and all of it in whatever form the press gets to it first. I understand. You might have preferred a quieter version of this. Mara. He leaned forward. He called you a loser in a room full of people and laughed about it. He spent months setting me up to take the fall for his fraud. I don't need it to be quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face settled. Okay, she said. What do you need from me? Cooperate with Carver. Stay on record as having submitted your documentation fully and without resistance. She hesitated. And be prepared for the board meeting Friday. You won't be in the room, but they'll be talking about you. Your clearance will be part of the formal record. I'll be ready. He stood. He looked at her across the conference table charcoal blazer, hair back, legal pad covered in notes in her small, precise handwriting. He thought about the first time he'd seen her write something down. 15 years ago, at a dinner with mutual friends, when someone had said something about market trends and she'd borrowed a pen and written 3 things on a cocktail napkin and folded it and put it in her pocket. He'd thought then, she's interesting. He'd had no idea. The phone call you took before the dinner, he said. Friday, when you were in your office and I was getting ready. She looked up. Yes. That was your legal team. Yes. Confirming the acquisition closed. Yes. And then you put on your dress and came downstairs and we drove to the Thornfield Club. Yes, she said very quietly. And you sat at that table and didn't say anything. While he stopped. You could have said something. You knew what you had, I know. But you didn't. No. He looked at her. Why? She held his gaze, and for a second she looked exactly like she had at the dinner table, the stillness of it, the inward quality. Because I didn't want to win by announcing a position, she said. I'd spent 12 years building something. I wasn't going to reduce it to a trump card at a dinner table. A pause. And because it wasn't what the moment needed. What did the moment need? She looked at him. The silence ran for 3 or 4 seconds, which was long enough to contain something real. What happened, she said finally. What you did. He held her gaze. Then he nodded once and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. I'll see you tonight, he said. Tonight, she agreed. He was at the door when she said, Ethan, he turned. She had the legal pad in her hands, not looking at it. I'm sorry. For the 11 years of it. I know I keep saying it, but I want you to know I mean it differently each time. He thought about that. About how an apology could contain different things at different moments, could grow and change shape as you understood more of what you were apologizing for. I know, he said. We'll get there. He went back to his floor and did the rest of his day's work. He did it carefully and completely, the way he'd always done it, and at 5:30, he shut his computer down and left. Victor Hale's formal confrontation with the board evidence happened the following morning, Friday, in a meeting that ran from 9 a. Until past 1 in the afternoon. Ethan wasn't in the room. He knew the broad shape of it from Gerald, who had a contact on the board's legal panel, and from the institutional sounds of the building itself, the elevated foot traffic on certain floors, the closed-door calls, the particular silence of a corridor where something significant is being decided. Victor had come in. That much Ethan knew before 9. He'd seen him in the lobby, not by design, just by timing, both of them arriving within minutes of each other. Victor had looked at him across the lobby with an expression that was hard to categorize. Not quite defiance. Not quite the practiced executive blankness he'd worn in his office the previous Monday. Something older and more honest than either of those, the way faces get when the performance has become too expensive to maintain. He hadn't said anything. Ethan hadn't either. Victor had gone to the elevator and pressed 14 and the doors had closed. Ethan had gone to his floor and waited. Mara walked into the boardroom at 9:15. Victor was already there, seated, with 2 attorneys and his executive assistant. The board members were arranged in their usual positions. Carver sat along the side wall with 2 members of her team, a banker's box of files on the table beside her. The room was cold. Someone had set the air conditioning too low, which happened sometimes when a facility's request went through the wrong queue and nobody had thought to fix it. Small detail. Mara noticed it because she noticed the physical specifics of rooms when she was managing her own nerves. She'd learned that about herself years ago, that the way she stayed inside a high-pressure moment was to let a small peripheral detail anchor her. The temperature, the water stain on the ceiling tile, the fact that one of Victor's attorneys had a pen cap he kept clicking at a rate of approximately once every 8 seconds. Victor looked older in this room than he had at the dinner. He'd looked powerful there, in command of the setting, in command of the people, comfortable with his own authority, in the particular way of someone who'd never seriously had it questioned. Here he looked like a man who had woken up and found the map he'd been relying on was wrong in ways he was still trying to calculate. The board chair, a man named Arthur Fleming, who was 72 and ran meetings with the precision of someone who had learned the hard way what happened when you didn't, called the session to order and outlined the purpose: to review the preliminary findings of the independent audit firm and to receive a formal response from the executive leadership. Carver presented for 40 minutes. She was dry and exact. The way good investigators are, she had no interest in drama, only in sequence and fact. She laid out the sub-3 transfers, the credential spoofing methodology, the administrative access trail, the timeline. She cross-referenced with 2 other suspicious transaction patterns her team had identified in earlier fiscal periods. She presented Ethan's parallel records and her team's determination that his authorization signatures had been replicated without his knowledge or consent. She concluded with the statement that the investigation was ongoing, but that current evidence pointed clearly to fraudulent manipulation of financial records by a person or persons with executive-level system access. She did not name Victor directly in the presentation. She didn't need to. Then Arthur Fleming looked at Victor's side of the table and said, "Mr. Hale, you've reviewed the preliminary findings. Would you like to respond?" Victor's lead attorney, a man named Presswick, who Ethan would later learn billed at $900 an hour, spoke first. He raised the conflict of interest argument. Blackstone Ridge's acquisition, he said, had been accompanied by an immediate call for governance review that suggested a predetermined agenda. The audit had been initiated by a shareholder whose husband was a subject of its findings, which created an irreconcilable bias in the process. He requested that the findings be set aside pending an independent review of the audit process itself. Mara's attorney responded before Arthur Fleming had to. He noted that the conflict of interest claim would require demonstrating that the audit findings were fabricated or distorted, which, given that the primary evidence consisted of system logs produced by the company's own infrastructure, would be an unusual argument to sustain. He further noted that Ethan Cole had been cleared of involvement, which rather undermined the premise that the audit had been structured to harm him. Victor's attorney pivoted. He argued that the credential spoofing finding was technically unverified, that system logs could be manipulated, that Carver's firm had a commercial relationship with Blackstone Ridge which compromised their neutrality. Carver, still seated along the side wall, looked up from her notes at that point and said, in her dry, even voice, "We have no commercial relationship with Blackstone Ridge Capital. We were retained by the board of Harlow Group Holdings on the recommendation of the company's existing legal counsel. I'm happy to provide documentation of that retention." A silence. Then Arthur Fleming said, "Thank you, Ms. Carver." Victor had been quiet through all of this. His attorneys were doing the technical work, and he was sitting with his hands flat on the table, watching the room. He looked, Mara thought, like a man watching weather move toward him across a flat landscape, fully aware of what was coming, without anywhere to go. Then Arthur turned to him directly. Victor, do you have anything to add? Personally. Victor looked at Arthur for a moment. Then he looked at Mara, and something changed in his face. The attorney's posture, the prepared position, the managed response dropped slightly. Just slightly, but enough. And what was underneath it was something that Mara hadn't expected. Not rage, not the cold boardroom calculation she'd seen in him from the first minute. What was underneath it was something that looked, if she had to name it honestly, like exhaustion. She built the better position, he said. It wasn't directed at anyone specifically. Just said, over 2 years apparently. I didn't see it. Arthur Fleming waited. The sub-3 account. Victor stopped. He looked at the table. His attorney touched his arm, a brief warning pressure, and Victor looked at the touch and then looked away from it. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the investigation is wrong, he said. Presswick said, quickly and quietly, Victor, I'd strongly advise. I know what you'd advise. Victor looked at his attorney with an expression that was almost tired. I've heard what you'd advise. He looked back at the table. I'm not going to tell you the investigation is wrong, he said again to the room. I'll let the legal process be the legal process. But I'm not going to sit in a room full of people I've worked with for 20 years and tell them their eyes are lying. The room was very still. Arthur Fleming said, Thank you, Victor. After the formal session ended, the board went into closed deliberation. Victor left with his attorneys. The hallway outside the boardroom was empty at that hour. Everyone who needed to be somewhere else had found a reason to be there. Mara stood at the window at the end of the corridor. The view from the 14th floor faced west, away from the bay, toward the residential districts and the hills that went brown in dry October. She stood there for about 10 minutes alone before anyone came to find her. It was Davis Crane. He was one of the 2 board members who had voted against proceeding with the governance review on the Monday after the acquisition. She knew that. She also knew he'd been in this company for 16 years and was a careful man who made his decisions slowly and was uncomfortable with rapid change. He stood beside her at the window. I voted against the audit, he said. I know. I thought it was precipitous, and I had concerns about the shareholder conflict. Those were reasonable concerns. He was quiet for a moment. Victor and I played golf every other Saturday for 12 years, he said. We went to each other's daughters' weddings. Mara looked at him. I know that must make this hard. He was good at his job, Davis said. For a long time he was very good at it. I don't think that was fake. I don't either. But, he said it slowly, what he did to your husband, the financial setup, and before that he stopped. I was at that dinner. I laughed. He looked at the window. Not for long. But I did. Mara didn't say anything to that. It wasn't her absolution to offer. I want you to know, Davis said, that I'll be voting with the board majority today. I appreciate you telling me. He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. You know, when you walked into that boardroom Monday morning, most of us assumed this was about the dinner. Personal score settling dressed up in fiduciary language. I know. Were we wrong? She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. The acquisition was legitimate. The governance failures were real and predated anything personal. She paused. But I'd be dishonest if I said the timing was entirely disconnected. I accelerated the review. I moved faster than I might have otherwise. She looked at him. I'm not perfect. I made a calculation, and I made it partly because of what I watched happen at that table. Davis studied her for a moment, at least you'll say so. There's not much point in being the person who exposes dishonesty if you're going to be dishonest about your own motives. He almost smiled. Then, what happens to the company now? The board selects an interim CEO pending a formal search. I've committed to a full operational review, but I have no interest in installing a figurehead who answers to me. I want independent leadership. That's better for everyone, including Blackstone Ridge. And Ethan, she looked at him. What about Ethan? His position, his career. Are you planning to use the ownership stake? No, she said, before he finished. Whatever Ethan does next, he does on his own record. She said it firmly enough that Davis nodded and didn't pursue it. That's not negotiable. The board deliberated for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Their decision, Victor Hale was removed from the position of CEO, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the formal legal investigation. A resolution supporting referral of the audit findings to the relevant authorities was passed 7-1, Davis voting with the majority. The single dissent coming from a board member who was Victor's personal appointment and whose own tenure was now under separate review. An interim executive management committee would oversee operations until a permanent replacement was identified. Ethan found out at 4:18 when Gerald texted him a single line, "Board resolution passed. VH removed. You're formally cleared in the board record." He was in his office. He read the message. He put his phone down. He thought about 11 years. He thought about the specific dream of a thing, the VP position, the title, the confirmation that the work had meant something, and how much of his identity he'd wound around that dream without fully realizing it. How he'd let the wanting of it make him smaller in certain moments, more careful with the wrong things, more forgiving of people who didn't deserve it. He thought about Mara, not the Mara of this week, the shareholder, the boardroom, the charcoal blazer, but Mara the way she'd been at their kitchen table on a Sunday night, her hands around a wine glass, telling him something true that cost her to say. Mara asleep in the passenger seat on the way home from the dinner, her head against the window, all the machinery of who she was temporarily at rest. Mara at 31, at 35, at 43, carrying a version of her life inside her life like a second heartbeat, scared to let it be seen. She'd been scared to let him see it. That was the thing he kept coming back to. She'd built something extraordinary and then hidden it from the person she slept next to, because she'd been afraid that knowing would change him, that he'd feel diminished, that the architecture of what they'd built together, his career as the visible thing, her work as the background, would collapse under the weight of the truth. She hadn't trusted him enough to let him try. That was real, and it had hurt him, and he wasn't finished being hurt by it. But she'd also spent 7 months shielding him from a trap he didn't know he was walking toward. 7 months of holding evidence that could have saved her time and disrupted her acquisition process, and she'd held it and managed it and waited, not because it was convenient for her, but because she was trying to protect him. The wrong method, the right instinct. He thought, we are both people who needed things from each other that we never quite knew how to ask for. He picked up his phone, called her. She picked up on the first ring. "I know," she said. "Gerald called you." "Yeah. How are you?" He thought about it honestly. "I'm okay. Genuinely okay, I think. Not just saying it. Good." Her voice was quieter than the boardroom voice, the legal strategy voice. "Just her. Come home?" "Leaving now," he said. He shut down his computer, put on his jacket, walked through the office, past his team who were packing up their own days. 2 of them looked at him as he passed, not intrusively, just with the specific awareness of people who'd been watching a difficult week and were glad to see it resolving. He took the elevator down. In the lobby, he stopped. There was one more thing. He went to the security desk and asked if Victor Hale had signed out. The guard, a young man who'd worked the lobby for 2 years and knew Ethan by name, checked his log and said, "Yes, mister." Hale had signed out at 3:40. Ethan nodded. He stood there for a second. He thought about the dinner, about the easy laughter, about the 11 years he'd given to a man who had been, in the end, capable of that laughter and also capable of worse. He thought about whether he was owed something, an apology, a confrontation, some form of acknowledgement from Victor that Ethan had been right about what mattered. He decided he wasn't going to wait for it. Some things people owed you that they were never going to pay. Waiting for them was its own kind of trap. He walked out through the revolving door. The October air was cold and clean, and the street was full of people heading home at the end of a Friday, moving through the ordinary current of the city. He found his car in the garage and sat behind the wheel for a minute before starting it. He thought about what Mara had said in the conference room. "I didn't want to win by announcing a position. 12 years of building, and when the moment came, she'd sat at a dinner table and been still and let the room be what it was. She'd waited for the right moment and the right ground and the right structure, and then she'd walked into a boardroom on a Monday morning and done it correctly. That was its own form of strength, one he hadn't had the vocabulary for before. He started the car. He pulled out of the garage into the Friday evening traffic and pointed himself toward home. Behind him, the Harlow Group building receded in the rearview mirror, 30 floors of glass and steel, a company that was about to become something different under leadership that hadn't arrived yet, story that wasn't finished. His own name in it somewhere, cleared, on the record, belonging to him. That part, at least, was his. He drove home. Mara was already home when he pulled into the driveway. The light above the front door was on the one they always left on, and through the kitchen window, He could see the warm yellow of the interior light and her shape moving somewhere inside. He sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, not because he needed to gather himself, but because he wanted to hold the moment before entering it. The way sometimes you stand outside a room and listen to an ordinary sound, water running, a cabinet closing, footsteps on hardwood, and feel something for which there isn't a precise word. Not gratitude exactly, not relief. Something in the neighborhood of both, but quieter. He went inside. She was at the stove, not cooking anything elaborate soup. From the smell of it, something with garlic and herbs. The kind of thing she made when neither of them had the energy for a real meal, but the body needed something warm. She'd changed out of the charcoal blazer into a sweater he recognized. Dark green, one she'd had for years, one of the first things she'd bought when they moved to this house. She looked at him when he came in. Just looked for a second, the way you look at someone when you've been carrying something heavy all day and have been waiting for them to walk through the door. "There's wine," she said, already open. He poured himself a glass and stood at the counter and watched her stir. The kitchen was warm. The radio was on low somewhere, not music exactly. Talk radio she wasn't listening to, just the sound of voices to fill the space. She turned that off after a minute. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like the week is over," he said. "Like I didn't know how much I needed it to be over until just now." She nodded. She turned the heat down under the pot and leaned against the counter across from him, her own glass in hand. "The board issued a formal statement at 5:30, she said. "It'll be in the business press by morning." "I know." Gerald texted, "Your name is in it. The clearance is explicit." "I know." She watched him over her glass. "Is that okay? Being named publicly?" He thought about it. "Yes. Actually, yes. I spent 2 weeks watching people in that building recalibrate how they looked at me, and I didn't say anything because there was nothing I could say yet. Having it in the record, having it written, that's not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing." They ate at the kitchen table. The soup was good, imperfect in the way home cooking and slightly too much salt. The bread he found in the cabinet a day past its best, and they ate it anyway, and it was fine. They talked about small things first, the way you do when both people know the large thing is still sitting in the room, and you need a few minutes before you're ready to face it fully. She mentioned that one of the board members had asked her about the timeline for the CEO search. He mentioned that his team had handled the week better than he'd given them credit for. Then the bowls were empty, and the bread was gone, and they were sitting with the last of the wine, and there wasn't any more small talk available. "I want to ask you something," Ethan said. "Okay. And I want you to answer it the same way you've been answering things this week, without managing the delivery." She set her glass down. "Ask, were you ever going to tell me about Blackstone Ridge? If the acquisition hadn't happened, if Victor had never done what he did, if it had just been an ordinary year, would you have told me eventually?" She was quiet for a long time, not avoiding the question. He could see her actually sitting inside it, turning it over. "I don't know," she said finally. "That's honest. I think I told myself I would. When the time was right, when the moment presented itself." She looked at the table. "But I'd been telling myself that for years, and the moment kept not presenting itself, which I think means I was waiting for a moment that I was also afraid would come." She looked up. "Does that make sense?" "It makes sense. It's also not okay." "I know it's not, Mara." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not going to keep punishing you for it. I want to be clear about that. I'm not built for carrying resentment long term, and I know that about myself. But I need to say it plainly at least once. You made a decision for 12 years that took away my ability to make my own decisions about our life. And that matters. It hurt. It's still hurting." "I know," she said. The words were quiet and without any defense in them. "I'm not the person you needed to protect," he said. "I would have handled it. I know that now. You knew it then, probably. If you'd let yourself." She looked at him with something that was stripped of all the professional precision, all the managing. "Just Mara. I was afraid," she said, "not of you. Of the thing between us changing. Of you looking at me and seeing an imbalance you hadn't signed up for. I know that was wrong. I know protecting something by hiding it isn't really protecting it. I knew that while I was doing it on some level." She pressed her lips together. "That might be the worst part, that I knew." He sat with that. The honesty of it landed differently than anything else she'd said this week, more painfully, but also more cleanly. You could work with honest. You couldn't work with managed. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I mean, that's where we start. That's the real ground." Not the version where you had perfectly understandable reasons and everything makes sense if you look at it right. The version where you knew, and you chose to continue, and now we know that about this marriage, and we have to figure out what to do with it. She was quiet for a moment. Are we figuring it out? Yeah, he said. I think we are, she exhaled. Not relief, more like the breath of someone who had been bracing for impact and found the impact was survivable. They stayed at the table a while longer. Not resolving everything, there wasn't a night long enough for that, but talking. Actually talking, the kind they hadn't done in longer than either of them wanted to name. He asked her things he'd never thought to ask. What it was like building Blackstone Ridge in the early years. The specific fear of the first big failure. The fund that had underperformed in year 4 that she'd had to restructure. The moment when she'd understood that what she'd built was no longer small. She told him, without the careful editing, without translating it into terms she thought he'd find palatable. Told it the way it was. He listened, he asked questions. He was surprised, more than once not by the scale of it, which he was still adjusting to, but by the texture of it, parts that had been hard in ways he hadn't imagined. The year she'd nearly lost a major investor and had spent 3 months managing that crisis from their home office while making dinner and attending his work events and never once showing the strain on her face. Specific loneliness of building something alone that you couldn't talk about. Did you ever want to tell me? He asked. Not as a decision point. Just did you ever feel it? The wanting to? She thought about it. Yes, regularly, especially in the early years. She looked at her hands. When something went well a good quarter, a deal that closed, a moment when I thought, I actually know what I'm doing, my first instinct was always to tell you. You were the person I wanted to tell, but you didn't. I kept redirecting it, turning it into something smaller than it was. He looked at her. I wish you'd told me. I know. I would have been, I'm not going to pretend I wouldn't have needed time to adjust. Probably would have. There's a version of me that would have been weird about it for a while. He was honest about that, but I would have gotten there, and you would have had someone to tell. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something she almost never did. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not with sentiment, not dramatically. Just set her hand on top of his hand the way you do when the words have been enough. And what's needed now is the simple fact of presence. He turned his hand over and held hers. They went to bed late. He didn't sleep right away, lay in the dark, thinking about the week, about Victor, about the shape that the next months were going to take. But it wasn't the anxious kind of sleeplessness. It was the kind where your mind is genuinely processing something, sorting it, filing it in the right places. He listened to Mara breathing beside him, asleep like she always was within 20 minutes of lying down. That capacity for rest, he'd envied it for years. He understood it better now. She'd been carrying a great deal for a long time, and the body learns to take its rest where it can. He fell asleep eventually. The next 3 months moved with the particular quality of time during which a great deal happens, and none of it happens quickly enough. Victor Hale's legal situation developed along the lines Carver had predicted. The referral of the audit findings to financial authorities resulted in a formal investigation, which expanded as investigators found threads that Carver's team hadn't reached. The sub-3 transfers were the most visible part, but not the only part. Over 14 years, Victor had developed a careful and patient set of habits around the company's finances that had been, for most of that time, nearly invisible, the kind of fraud that required years of accumulated authority to execute and only became legible when someone looked at the whole of it rather than any single piece. His attorneys were good. The legal process would take the time it took. But by November, Victor had resigned all remaining board affiliations, and his name had moved from the business section to the legal section of the press, which is a particular kind of professional ending, the kind that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but with the steady withdrawal of everyone who had once found the association useful. Ethan watched it happen from a distance. He didn't take pleasure in it, exactly, though he didn't pretend to have no feelings about it either. He'd been set up by that man. He'd given 11 years of genuine work and genuine loyalty to someone who had been comfortable letting him walk into a trap. You didn't process that cleanly in 3 months, or probably in 3 years. You just lived with it while the legal process ran its course and tried not to let it make you smaller than you'd been before. He was more careful now about who he extended loyalty to. Not cynical, he hadn't arrived at cynicism, and he didn't want to. But more attentive to the difference between someone who valued your work and someone who valued you, because those were, he'd learned, not the same transaction. The interim executive management committee that ran Harlow Group through November and December was neither perfect nor disastrous, which was about the best you could hope for in a transition period. 2 of its 3 members were competent people who kept the company operational while the formal CEO search moved through its stages. By December, the board had identified a shortlist. By January, they had an offer. The new CEO was a woman named Diane Rafferty, 51 years old, previously CEO of a mid-sized firm in Chicago that she'd turned around over 6 years. She was known for being direct, for not particularly enjoying meetings, for moving faster than boards usually liked, and delivering results that made them retrospectively comfortable with the pace. She arrived at Harlow Group in the second week of January and spent her first 3 days reading files and talking to people before she moved any furniture. She came to Ethan's office on day 4. He'd known she was doing rounds everyone knew. She made no secret of it. She knocked on his open door at 11 in the morning and said, "You're Ethan Cole." "I am," he said. "Can I sit, please?" She sat. She had a directness to her attention. She looked at you, and you felt looked at, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way of someone who didn't do small talk for its own sake. "I've read your file," she said, "and the audit documentation. All of it. Okay, your records are remarkable. Not the content of them, the practice. The habit." She leaned back slightly. "That's not something you can teach people. They either do it or they don't. I started doing it because it helped me sleep," he said. "Not for strategic reasons." She looked at him steadily. "How long have you been at this company?" 11 years in March, and the VP position you were in line for was withdrawn when Victor decided I was no longer useful to him. Before all of this, I know why it was withdrawn. I'm asking how you feel about the fact that it was." He considered the question honestly. "I wanted it for a long time. I wanted it for reasons that were about the work, and for reasons that were about needing someone like Victor to tell me the work was real. Those are different things, and I conflated them for longer than I should have." She was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusually candid answer. You didn't seem like someone who was looking for the other kind." Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not a smile, she wasn't a smiling type. He'd gathered but an acknowledgement. "I'm building a leadership team," she said. "I'm not inheriting Victor's structure uncritically. Some of it stays, some of it doesn't. I need people who know this company from the inside and aren't so attached to how things were that they can't think about how they should be." She looked at him. "I'd like you to be considered for the VP of Operations position, formally, through the evaluation process. Your file will go to the committee along with 3 other candidates." He looked at her. "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead. Is this related to Mara, to Blackstone Ridge?" She held his gaze. "Mara Cole's ownership stake has nothing to do with why you're on my list. Your record is why you're on my list." She paused. "I'll tell you what I told the board. I don't work in someone else's shadow, including the majority shareholders. If she has operational preferences, she can attend board meetings. My team is mine." "That's what I needed to hear," he said. "Good, you'll hear from HR by end of week." She stood, nodded once, and left. He sat there for a moment after she was gone, his hands on his desk, looking at the doorway she'd just walked out of. The evaluation process ran through January and into February. 4 candidates, a structured review, a panel that included 2 board members and 2 external assessors. He submitted his documentation, interviewed twice, gave a presentation on operational efficiency that he'd been building toward in theory for 2 years, and finally had the space to articulate clearly. He didn't perform it. He just said what he thought, what he knew, what 11 years of paying attention had taught him about how the operational mechanics of a company like this one actually functioned versus how they appeared to function on a chart. The second interview ran 40 minutes over time because Diane kept asking questions. He was offered the position on a Wednesday morning in late February by HR in the standard formal language of those calls. He said yes. He thanked them. He hung up. Then he sat at his desk and did something he hadn't expected to do, which was nothing, for about 5 minutes. Just sat there. It wasn't the version of this moment he'd imagined for 11 years. He'd imagined the Victor version, Victor's hand extended, Victor's approval delivered across a table, the confirmation arriving from the man who had represented the summit of the particular mountain Ethan had been climbing. That version had its own shape in his mind, its own specific weight. This was different, quieter, less theatrical. Diane Rafferty didn't do theatrical, and the process had been designed precisely to be immune to theater. He'd gotten the position through a committee process, where no one in the room owed him anything, where Mara's name had been left outside the door, where his record had been the only argument he'd been permitted to make on his own behalf. It was his. That was the thing. He'd carried the idea of earning something for 11 years and had never been entirely sure he'd done it, because you can work hard in someone's company and produce real results and still never fully separate your achievement from the architecture of approval that surrounds it. He knew that now. He'd known it since October. But this a committee, a process, no thumb on the scale, this was the thing you could put in your chest and keep. He texted Mara, "I got it." Her reply came in 30 seconds, "I know. Diane called me as a courtesy after they called you. She wanted me to know the decision was independent." A pause, the 3 dots appearing and disappearing. "Then I thought that was worth knowing." He smiled. "It is," he wrote back. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You did this." He put his phone in his pocket and went back to work. That evening, he found the note. It wasn't something he'd been looking for. He'd been going through the box of things in the top of the bedroom closet, the miscellaneous accumulation that every long-term household generates, looking for a warranty card he was fairly sure he'd never find. Old cables, a watch that needed a battery, a pair of reading glasses he'd thought he'd lost, a folder of documents he should have filed years ago. And then, between 2 folders, a folded piece of paper that had once been white and had gone slightly yellow at the edges with age. He unfolded it. Mara's handwriting. He'd know it anywhere, the small, slightly tilted letters, the way she made her T's and her lowercase e's. A note brief on paper torn from a legal pad. He stood there and read it. "I know it's hard right now. I know you don't always feel like it's going the way it should. But I need you to hear this. They are lucky to have you. Not because of what you produce for them, because of who you are when you show up. Don't let them make you forget that." No date. But he knew. He remembered the night she'd given it to him, though he'd forgotten it until this moment, 12 years ago, early in his time at a different company. Particularly brutal stretch when the work was going badly, and his confidence had hit one of those walls it hits periodically. The wall that says, maybe you're not what you thought. She had left the note on his side of the bathroom sink, where he'd find it in the morning. He remembered finding it. He remembered feeling, that morning, steadier than the night before. He'd put it somewhere in a pocket probably, or a jacket, and at some point it had migrated into the accumulated geography of the house. He stood in the bedroom holding it for a long time. He thought about 12 years, about the particular arithmetic of what you know about a person and what you don't, and how those 2 things coexist inside a marriage without either canceling the other. He'd thought he understood Mara, her patience, her capacity for quiet, the way she could enter a difficult situation without broadcasting that she was doing so. He'd attributed those qualities to temperament, to a kind of natural steadiness he'd always slightly envied. He understood now that they were also skills, practiced and earned and costly in ways he hadn't been able to see, because he'd never thought to ask what maintaining them required of her. She'd believed in him clearly, explicitly, in writing, 12 years ago, before any of the evidence of this week existed. Before the VP position was real, before Diane Rafferty, before the formal record of clearance. She'd believed in him when he was just a man hitting a wall in an ordinary career in an ordinary year, and she'd put it on paper in her small, tilted handwriting and left it somewhere he'd find it. That was the thing underneath all of it. The thing that had been there the whole time, even when they were both too busy or too defended or too scared of the wrong things to see it clearly. Came into the bedroom. At some point he'd been standing there long enough that the light outside had changed and stopped when she saw his face. "What is it?" He held out the note. She came forward and took it. "Read it." Her expression did something complicated and quiet. "I forgot about this," she said. "So did I. Where was it?" "The box in the closet, with the dead batteries and the cables for things we don't own anymore." She almost laughed. A small sound, but real. "You wrote that 12 years ago," he said. "I know. Before any of this, before Blackstone Ridge was what it became. Before I knew any of it. Yes, you believed it then." He looked at her. "You believed in me when there was no external reason to." She looked at the note in her hands. "There was always reason," she said quietly. "I was watching you. I knew what you were doing and how you were doing it, and I always knew that it would matter eventually. That the quality of it would matter." She looked up. I didn't know how to tell you that in a way that didn't also require telling you everything else." He looked at her for a long moment. "You could have just said, I think you're good at what you do. I know. You didn't have to own a company for the opinion to mean something." She looked at him. Something in her face went very still. "I know that," she said, and then softer, "I think I needed to hear you say it." He went to her then. Not dramatically, just crossed the space between them and put his arms around her. The ordinary physical fact of two people who had been in a difficult place and had come through it imperfectly but intact. She leaned into him in the specific way she had her forehead against his collarbone, her arms around his back. They stood there in the bedroom with the last of the winter light going gray at the window. "We have to keep talking," he said into her hair. "I know. Not just about this. About everything. I don't want us to go back to the way it was where you'd take calls in a closed room, and I don't think to ask. I don't want that either. And I need you to trust me enough to let me see the real version. Not the managed one. I'm working on it," she said. "That's honest. It's not a switch I can flip. I've been managing the presentation for so long that I sometimes don't notice I'm doing it. I know. I'm not asking for immediate." He pulled back enough to look at her. "I'm asking for direction." She looked up at him. Her face was tired and real, and exactly the face he'd chosen 15 years ago, without knowing most of what it was carrying. "Okay," she said. "Direction." He held the note. He thought about what it meant to believe in someone, the actual practice of it, not the sentiment. It wasn't a feeling. Feelings came and went, rose and fell with the weather of a marriage. Believing in someone was an act you renewed. You looked at them clearly, at the imperfect whole of them, the choices they got wrong, the fears that made them smaller than they needed to be, and you decided to see what they were capable of instead of being stopped by what they'd failed at. You did that on an ordinary Tuesday, and on the bad days, and on the days when they'd frustrated you enough that generosity felt like a stretch. Mara had done that for him for 12 years from behind a closed door. She'd done it imperfectly and secretly, and in ways that cost both of them things they didn't fully reckon until the bill came due. She'd also done it genuinely, without performance, without expectation of credit, in a small tilted handwriting on a piece of legal pad paper that had yellowed in a box in a closet. He had not always done it for her. He could see that now. He'd loved her, believed in the fact of her, but he'd also made assumptions about the scale of her life that had flattened her into something simpler than she was. He'd taken the closed door as information: she's private, she's quiet, she doesn't need much, rather than as a question he should have asked. He'd been so occupied with the visible landscape of his own career that he hadn't thought to ask what she was building in the space he couldn't see. That was on him. He wasn't going to dress it up. What he could do was what you always could do, which was start from where you were and be more careful going forward. Show up differently. Ask the questions he'd been too preoccupied to ask. Make room in the architecture of their shared life for the full version of who she was, not the version that was most convenient for the story he'd been telling about them. That was the work. Not the boardrooms, not the legal proceedings, not the public record of who had done what to whom and what the consequences were. All of that was the surface of it. The work was this bedroom, this note, this woman looking at him in the last light of a February evening. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. Marriages don't transform. They shift, slowly, along the grain of the effort you put into them, and the shift is rarely visible day to day and only legible in retrospect. They had hard conversations and incomplete ones. They had evenings where they'd made progress and mornings where an old pattern resurfaced, and they had to name it and put it down again. He asked her questions about Blackstone Ridge, and she answered them not always easily, not always without the old instinct to compress and translate, but she caught herself doing it more often now, and that was something. She kept the office door open more. Small thing. He noticed. He told her about his work differently too, not just the outcomes but the texture of it, the days when the judgment calls were difficult. The moments of uncertainty he'd previously kept to himself out of a vague sense that he was supposed to have it figured out. She listened without managing his experience. He noticed that too. Victor's legal proceedings moved through their bureaucratic stages. His attorneys negotiated. Investigators found more. By spring it had settled into the long, unglamorous middle of a complex financial fraud case, which would take the time it would take and produce an outcome that would be recorded in court documents and business databases, and eventually, probably, forgotten by everyone except the people who had lived inside it. That was how most reckonings worked. Not with a final dramatic scene, but with the slow attrition of documentation and process. Ethan found he thought about Victor less as the months passed. Not because it hadn't mattered, it had, significantly. But because the space Victor had occupied in his thinking for 11 years, the approval-shaped space, the validation-shaped space, was being filled by other things. By the actual work of his new role, which was difficult in the specific satisfying way of things that require your full capacity. By the ongoing project of his marriage. By the smaller things that accumulate around a life when you start paying attention to them the way you should have all along. He had a conversation in April with a young man on his team 28. Ambitious in the way of people who are good and know it, but haven't yet had to reckon with the gap between what they're capable of and what the world will immediately give them. Came to Ethan frustrated after being passed over for a lead role on a project. "It's not fair," the young man said. Ethan looked at him. "No," he said. "It's not particularly. You were qualified." "Then why?" "Because qualified isn't enough by itself. Because other people were also qualified, and the decision had factors in it that weren't about your performance on paper." He paused. "And because sometimes the timing is wrong, and you have to build more before the right moment shows up." "How do you know the right moment will show up?" Ethan thought about that honestly. "You don't," he said. "Not guaranteed. But you do know this. If you spend the time in between chasing the validation instead of getting better, you'll be worse positioned when the moment comes. The work is the thing, not who acknowledges it." The young man looked at him. "Did you believe that? When you were 28? "No," Ethan said. "I'm telling you because I didn't." One evening in May, a Friday, warm enough that they ate outside for the first time that year, Mara mentioned that Blackstone Ridge was considering another significant acquisition. Complicated structure, emerging market exposure, a longer horizon than most of what they'd done before. She talked about it for 20 minutes across the dinner table with a specificity and passion that he'd never heard before, because he'd never been permitted to hear it before. She talked about the risk structure and the timing and why she thought the market was mispricing a specific type of asset. She talked about the argument she'd had with one of her analysts who disagreed with her read and why she thought he was wrong but kept him in the room because being disagreed with was one of the few reliable ways to find your own blind spots. He listened. He asked questions. Some of them were naive, and he knew it. She answered them without talking down to them. At the end, she stopped and said, "Am I going on too long?" "No," he said. "Keep going." She looked at him. Something in her face, something small and careful and long-held, let go. She kept going. The note lived on his desk now. Not framed, not displayed prominently, just there, folded, in the corner near his lamp where he could see it if he was looking. He looked at it sometimes when the day was hard, when the self-doubt that never entirely goes away surfaced and needed to be shown the door. They are lucky to have you, not because of what you produce, because of who you are when you show up. He thought about that distinction more than he expected to. What you produce was what the world measured. It was what went into a file, what appeared on a clearance document, what earned a promotion through a committee process. It was real and it mattered. But who you are when you show up, that was different. That was whether you stood up at a dinner table when you could have stayed seated. Whether you kept parallel records not for strategic reasons, but because the work deserved to be done right. Whether you told a hard truth to your wife at a kitchen table and then stayed in the room for the uncomfortable silence after it. That was the thing you couldn't manufacture and couldn't fake and couldn't have bestowed on you by a powerful person's approval. It was the thing that was either there, in the daily practice of your choices, or it wasn't. He was still working on it. He expected he would be for a long time. So was she. That was, he'd come to think, the most honest thing you could say about any two people who had decided to build a life together. They were both still working on it, imperfectly and without a guarantee, in the direction of something they were choosing every ordinary day to believe was worth it. The light was good in May. It came through the kitchen window at an angle that made everything in the room look worth keeping. He washed the dinner dishes. She dried them and put them away. That was all. That was enough.